Picture this. A shadowy, undead, cloaked figure rises from their own coffin. Their sharp and infected fangs retract from their pale mouth. Their connections to the dark arts of the occult have given them the ability to transform into a terrifying bat, the curse of immortality, and a chronic addiction to drinking blood. You are most likely picturing a vampire right now. Perhaps it's a classic literary interpretation of the vampire like Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, or Bram Stoker's Dracula. More likely, it was a cinematic interpretation of the latter. Maybe Bela Lugosi or Gary Oldman. No matter who you had in your head, it's quite unlikely that you would have been thinking of a character that would appeal to a child. Be it through themes or gory imagery, vampires are inherently quite mature. But what if I told you that these three characters from G or PG rated films also fit the exact description that I gave earlier? In fact, there are many more characters from children's or family films that could be aptly described in the same manner. And if you were to remove the adjectives undead and blood-sucking, you could find even more. It may seem bizarre, but vampires are all over the place in children's media.
Don't be scared. I'm the super sweet monster with the super sweet new cereal, Count Chocula.
But when did this trend start, and what film cemented vampires as a staple in kids' movies? With this video, I hope to get to the bottom of the wild world of this phenomenon. I also hope to answer why these films were made to begin with. What are the different ways that vampires are used in family movies? And what types of themes did filmmakers attempt to instill in kids through the use of vampires? Well, let's find out. Alright, so in order to fully understand the surprisingly vast catalog of family-friendly vampire films, it can be necessary to see what types of content led to their inception. Although stories, novels, and plays based off vampires have been popular since the 1700s, early vampire films were what fully solidified them as a fearsome monster in widespread cultural consciousness. In fact, 1931's Dracula made over $700,000 in profit. This was Universal's most financially successful release up until that point. And while these early vampire movies might seem tame to us jaded or desensitized modern audiences who have been exposed to some pretty extreme horror in film, it's important to remember that these movies freaked people out back in the day. Films like Nosferatu and Vampire evoked fear through how they played into European folklore. Todd Browning's Dracula was equally scary to audiences. Some movie palaces even had nurses on hand to console fainting audiences who were shocked by Bela Lugosi's portrayal of the character. These films were clearly not made for kids. But as time went on and many adaptations were made, vampires slowly became a little more campy and a little less frightening. By 1948, Universal themselves had become willing to shine a humorous light on their beloved monster characters, and they released Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Within the feature-length film, the titular comedic duo also encounters other monsters, including Dracula, played once again by Bela Lugosi. Lugosi plays the character straightly, but the film still finds absurdity within the idea of vampires. A few smaller vampire comedies, similar to this one, would release in the decade to follow. These would all be steps towards making vampires less horrific and more family-friendly. In 1961, the Addams Family and the Munsters would bring vampires to a much more accessible medium.
But I know what's going on. You just can't wait to see me in my grave.
Oh, Grandpa, we've seen you there lots of times before.
These early television sitcoms made it clear that vampires didn't have to be scary, and could be quite lovable. Plus, while they weren't directly made for children, the fact that there was usually only one TV in most households, if they had one at all, meant that primetime television had to be designed to cater to all age ranges. Thus, these two shows featured the first vampires that were really marketed as family-friendly. All of these portrayals would lead to a definitive launching point for vampires in children's media, and arguably, one of the most famous vampires of all.
Greetings, I am the Count.
The purple Muppet, Count Von Count, who lives on Sesame Street, was introduced in 1972. The Count with a knack for counting is confirmed to have been visually inspired by Bela Lugosi's Dracula, although it's somewhat unclear why. There's definitely the fact that the name Count von Count was just too good of a play on words to pass up on. However, others speculate that the Count was originally designed as a vampire because both European and Chinese folk stories connected their versions of vampires to the mental disorder of arithmomania. It's a mental disorder similar to OCD. Individuals who suffer from arithmomania have a nearly irresistible need to count the things they do or the objects that they see. In Chinese folklore specifically, one of the most surefire ways to avoid a vampire was to throw rice at them. The vampire would have to stop pursuing you in order to count every single grain. This impulse to count can clearly be seen in Sesame Street's Count. Now, granted, perhaps an even simpler explanation for his appearance is that the unique, macabre, gothic look of vampires was visually stimulating enough to keep children engaged while learning about more boring subjects like math. But that brings us to the next question about this important character. Is he even a vampire at all?
Hey, is the Count a vampire?
What's that?
Well, he's got those big fangs. Have they ever shown him doing somebody in and then feeding on him?
You're asking if they've ever done a Sesame Street in which the Count kills somebody and then sucks their blood for sustenance?
Yeah.
No, they've never done that.
According to the showrunners, he isn't a vampire. In fact, even though he has fangs, a phobia of garlic, a fondness of bats, and sleeps upside down, the word vampire has apparently never appeared in an episode of Sesame Street. This didn't stop many parents from feeling outrage directed towards the character. One perturbed Pennsylvania parent wrote in a letter to the showrunners that it seems poisonous to make a monster to appear as a competent teacher because such an appearance would seem to mislead children into trusting Dracula, and possibly monsters in general. And even if the show doesn't acknowledge the Count's vampirism, the media surrounding the Muppet has been a little less clear.
Is the Count from Sesame Street a vampire? Yes, but I am a vampire with an unquenchable thirst for numbers.
It doesn't look like only numbers to me. The point is, vampire or not, the Count is undeniably a turning point in the use of vampires in family-friendly media. And, now that we've seen the Count and progressive softening of the vampire, we can understand how they've ended up in places like the Disney Channel. Now we can get into the different ways that films have used vampires to tell a compelling and thematically relevant narrative. I've watched a bunch of films for this, and have split some of the noteworthy examples into two distinct categories based on how they portray the vampires. So, let's get into them. The first type of film finds the vampires squarely filling the role of the bad guy. Within this type of film, the vampires are rarely anything more than a monster to be defeated by the human protagonist. This harkens back to the ways that vampires were depicted in the classic monster films of the past. Usually, the camera assumes the POV of a human character who has to navigate the wild world of vampires. The audience is able to align with them, as they are just as unfamiliar with the concept of vampires as the protagonist. We latch onto the most human characters that we can see. Now, as audiences throughout time have become inundated by vampire movies, it became less necessary to build the world in this way. Instead, the 70s saw the vampires be humanized, and oftentimes at the center of the story. We'll touch on this more later, but the important idea for now is that the history of children's films with vampires followed a similar trajectory to mature films with vampires, in order to familiarize their audiences with the concepts. Early and more simplistic films pose the vampires as inhuman antagonists. Oftentimes, their physical appearances reflect their monstrous qualities. They are often hulking abominations, or if they are humanoid, they are shown to be larger than life through camera work. These films do everything they can to distance themselves from the idea that vampires are physically human, as it could complicate their themes. I think a great film entry point to discuss within this category is actually Scooby-Doo and the Legend of the Vampire. Now, it might kind of break the chronological order that we had going up until this point, but this film perfectly epitomizes what this style of film has to offer. Now, this isn't the first time that the Mystery Incorporated gang encountered a vampire. That would be in a 1977 episode of The Scooby-Doo Show, where they meet Gramps the Vamp, who has the makings of a vampire, but like most Scooby-Doo villains, is revealed to be a normal human in the end. Then, 1988's Scooby-Doo and the Reluctant Werewolf features a very real Dracula, who also attempts to straight up kill Shaggy. However, the film rarely focuses on the vampires, whereas 2003's Legend of the Vampire places a lot of emphasis on the creature. Much of the film is spent characterizing this giant guy and his lesser accomplices. Unlike most of the films that we'll be looking at later, this film doesn't rely on classic gothic semantics or genre pastiche to create a convincing vampire. I can appreciate that they leaned into a new interpretation of the vampire, and also tied it into Australian folklore creatures. This is fitting, seeing as how the film is centered around the gang's vacation to Australia in order to attend a music festival. The mannerisms and look of the vampire were derived from Australian cryptids like Bunyip and Taniwha. Plus, the name of the vampire, Yowie Yahoo, is taken from the name of the Australian version of Bigfoot, Yowie. And yes, you heard me right. The vampire's name in this movie is Yowie Yahoo. It is definitely one of the most bizarre, non-English sounding names that they could have gone with. And that's something I've seen a lot in the movies I've viewed in order to make this video. When films want to villainize their vampires or make them seem frightening, they will often play up the aspects of the character that make them different from the culture that produced the film. Because, of course, there's nothing scarier than a culture that we don't fully understand. Yeah, these movies that place vampires solely in the villainous position sometimes have some weird xenophobic undertones, especially considering the things that are supposed to be making the vampires scary are names, accents, idiosyncrasies, and even customs that are inspired by real-world cultures. These problematic themes might even be the intention, considering the original vampire stories are often full of isolationist themes about the dangers that immigrants, specifically Jewish people, were said to bring with them. Considering the film began production shortly after the September 11th terrorist attacks, a cultural fear of the other may have been rearing its head more commonly in society. Now, am I really suggesting that a Scooby-Doo film about a pop-punk battle of the bands has coded messages about post-9/11 international relations? Maybe, I don't know, but either way, the film is one of the easiest films to deconstruct how the vampire is villainized, and it's pretty ugly. Many of the techniques to make vampires irredeemably evil that are on display here also appear in plenty of other films, such as The Batman vs. Dracula, Archie and the Riverdale Vampires, and even films with more mature content like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. In the year 2000, Mom's Got a Date with a Vampire was released as a Disney Channel original movie. This film has its protagonist siblings, who are constantly at odds with each other, team up to sneak out while being grounded. To do this, they set their mom up on a date with an affluent and erudite foreigner named Dimitri. It's not long, of course, before they realize that Dimitri is actually a vampire. Similar to the more adventurous Todd Browning Dracula, the kids turn to Van Helsing to help take down the vampire. And, just like in Scooby-Doo, this guy is pretty vile. He assaults kids and hypnotizes their parents, and in a scene that was deleted after the first screening and scrubbed from the entirety of the internet, Dimitri looks at the cute family dog while licking his lips, implying, of course, that he was gonna kill the dog and feast upon it. He may not be as physically imposing as Yowie Yahoo, but the visual effects used to punctuate his actions reinforce Dimitri's lack of humanity. The film plays into anxiety about 1980s ideas of stranger danger with Dimitri. The mere act of deceiving the children is partially what makes the vampire so evil. The film begs children to be more careful of who they trust. Films that came out during the height of the stranger danger campaign make these themes even more obvious.
Hey kid, I'll teach you how to hit this ball right over the fence. Come on, it'll be fun.
Trust your own feelings.
For example, The Monster Squad is a slightly more edgy movie that was kind of advertised to preteens in the same way that something like Goonies was. Within this film, Count Dracula is almost an exact replica of Bela Lugosi's signature portrayal. He's cunning and somewhat charming, but is also undeniably evil to the core. If the themes of being cautious around strangers weren't obvious already, the pedophilic undertones become quite clear when Dracula transforms some high school girls into his own brides. But perhaps these attempts to completely villainize the vampires have taught children to be too quick to hate those that are different from themselves. And that is where the second category of film comes in.
Peekaboo!
If we go back to looking at the timeline of mature vampire stories, The 1970s are where we start to see some major changes. No longer are the stories exclusively told through the eyes of humans who are at odds with vampires. Instead, vampires are the ones who now get to tell their own tales. We finally realize that vampires can be good people who are just dealing with some unfortunate afflictions. In the intro to their book, Growing Up with Vampires, Essays on the Undead in Children's Media, Simon Bacon and Katarzyna Bronk say that this trend of humanizing vampires was kicked off by Anne Rice's 1976 book, Interview with the Vampire. Vampires were far more complex than simple monsters at this point. A similar change would occur in the family vampire film world, albeit a few decades later. In her essay, Every Generation Gets the Vampire It Needs, Children's Vampire Films and Constructions of Childhood in the 21st Century, Alison Moore suggests that this shift in the monstrosity of vampires has a lot to do with society's views on normativity. After all, vampires are anything but normal humans. So, as our culture has taken steps away from a more conservative ideal of striving for traditional normality, vampires have become less villainized, as they represent a sense of deviation from the classical norms. And this is true on a level of race, sexuality, and gender. By highlighting vampires as heroes, children are encouraged to embrace their own liberty and identity, and make their own choices. Well, that's the idea anyway. 2012's Hotel Transylvania demonstrates these themes to a T. After humans killed his wife in a violent mob, Count Dracula, played surprisingly well by Adam Sandler, seeks to do what he can to raise his daughter away from this destructively exclusionary world. His internal conflict throughout the film is learning to give his daughter the very independence that we just discussed moments ago. He must learn to let his daughter make her own decisions about the humans, even if his own lived experiences make him resentful towards them. The film follows Dracula as he runs a hotel in Transylvania that offers a safe space for all monsters to be free from the violent persecution from humans. The vampires, and other monsters, are fully and undebatably good within this film. Morally, the vampires' actions are completely innocuous throughout the entirety of the runtime. The worst thing that we witness is a vampire accidentally scare a human, so the human's hatred for them seems entirely unjustified. Of course, this is one of the themes of the film. Rather than telling kids that people that are different from us are inherently evil and shouldn't be trusted, a la the previous category, these films instead say that people that are different are also full of the same human emotions that we experience. Again, the vampire's physical appearance tells us all we need to know. Dracula and his daughter look like everyday people who just happen to dress a little bit funny. Plus, how could a person who does this possibly be a merciless killer?
Maybe just a little. So listen, all you singers from here to Beijing, you better crash the box string, get ready to clean. Cause if love was money, you'd be getting cha-ching next to a zinc, Cupid's arrows, a little beast.
They're just like us, and we just need to give them a chance. I suppose it's fitting that Genndy Tartakovsky, who has become widely known for his recent animation, which is decidedly not child-friendly, would direct a film about monsters who many would view in the same way. But like the existence of these fluffy Hotel Transylvania films suggests about Tartakovsky, the themes here showcase that vampires can be peaceful even when they are widely known for their brutality in other media. And as we'll see, other films in this category do the same thing. A favorite among many is the 2000 film, The Little Vampire. The film follows a boy named Tony, who is feeling lost in his life after his family moves to Scotland. But before long, Tony meets Rudolph, a friendly vampire. The few adults who actually believe that Tony met a vampire are completely terrified of the creatures, based on the stories that they've heard growing up. However, the film shows us that none of these tales about vampires being ferocious bloodsuckers are true at all. In fact, they decided to go out of their way to show the audience the process of the vampires consuming the blood of a live cow without killing it.
I think I'm gonna hurl.
Yeah, that sound design is pretty disturbing, but at least we know, just like in Hotel Transylvania, that these vampires are good people and would never harm a non-vampiric human or even a cow. There is no moral grayness. These are the heroes of the story. Tony is left alone to team up with the vampires to defeat the ruthless vampire hunter. The concept is almost the exact inverse of a film like Mom's Got a Date with a Vampire. Something interesting about this one is that the film is still seen through the eyes of a human protagonist. So, the audience still has a baseline to compare the vampire's strangeness to. And they are kinda strange. They dress eccentrically, talk in a strange cadence, and of course, they turn into bats. However, unlike films which villainize vampires, this strangeness isn't there to make us hate the vampires more. The filmmakers don't want their audience to subscribe to the fear of the other. Instead, the whole point of this movie is that the adults are hard stuck in their ways and lack the ability to look past their preconceived notions about other cultures. Only a child is able to look deeper and see the good people that are afflicted with vampirism. Alright, so great. I think we've got some understanding of the two diametrically opposed ways that family films can handle the topic of vampires. But before we close, I'd like to talk about another vampire family film that didn't quite fit neatly into either of the two categories. This final movie is 2020's Vampires vs. the Bronx. Now, it's actually a PG-13 film, and a bit more mature. But it's about a realistic group of youths, and I thought it was just too good of a film not to talk about here. In fact, of the family vampire films that I watched, it was my favorite, because of the way that it handles its themes. In many ways, this film places its vampires solely in the role of the villain. However, some of the vampires are shown to have remorse for their actions, and don't originally create trouble with malicious intent, and the film has no problem humanizing the vampires physically. So, I decided to forego putting this film in either of the categories, as it seemed too restrictive, seeing as how this film is quite unique in its portrayals. Plus, the film addresses topics that no other movie attempted to look at. In particular, the film uses vampires as a metaphor for gentrification, which, if you think about it, has always been a part of many vampire narratives. Here, the Bronx must work past their differences to defeat the rich vampires development company. It uses the infectious allure of vampires to help convey complex themes to a younger audience, which is ultimately what all of the films here have attempted to do. Now, there are plenty more films that I can mention, and some of them are pretty good too, but ultimately, many of the others have the exact same themes to present. Very few have done anything quite as interesting as Vampires vs. the Bronx. Now, I should mention that there are some films which showcase vampires in a nuanced way, placing them somewhere between the otherwise rigid borders of good and evil. Usually this is done by having some vampires in the film world be heroes, while others are villains. At the heart of these stories is a somewhat individualist ideal that a person's, or vampires in this case, identity shouldn't be defined by the actions of the social groups that they belong to. This argues directly against the fear of the other presented in films such as The Monster Squad or Mom's Got a Date with a Vampire, while still providing more subtlety than films like Hotel Transylvania or The Little Vampire, which largely just seek to flip the vampire story on its head. The reason I didn't create a new category for these kind of films is that they're quite rare, and mostly because the lessons that they offer aren't that different from the other films that we've discussed here. Instead, they just fall somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, rather than the extremes that we've been looking at. So, to wrap up, while children might not seem like a target audience for a vampire narrative, there are plenty of different films that nevertheless employ the fanged creatures to appeal to younger audiences. The different ways of depicting vampires in these films have been able to teach a variety of lessons that contemporary society deems as important. So, in looking at how family vampire movies change over time, it's also possible to get a sense of how culture has changed over that same period. And with films like Hotel Transylvania and Vampires vs. the Bronx being released pretty recently, I don't think that this style of movie has been fully drained of its vitality. Thanks for watching.